What happens when you give a living thing everything that it needs except space? Picture with me a movie theater in 1986. You walk in one weekend and you see a movie called An American Tale about a mouse fleeing from Russia to America. You walk in another weekend and you see a movie called The Great Mouse Detective, a movie about a tiny little mouse, basically a young Sherlock Holmes, solving mysteries on the streets of London. And even a few years earlier, you could watch a movie called The Secret of NIMH about a mouse named Mrs. Brisby fighting to save her family. 3 studios, 3 different movies, all of them about mice. When you look at it from an outside perspective, it might seem like a coincidence, but I can assure you it is not. If you start to pull on this thread about why there were so many mouse-focused movies in like the 70s and 80s, you'll eventually unwind it just far enough to find a single government scientist who built his entire career building these tiny mice societies in a lab and watching them fall apart. And he did all of this by asking a single uncomfortable question. What happens when you give a living thing everything that it needs except space? And that question did not just stay inside the laboratory. That question slipped its way into a children's book, and then into Hollywood movies, into a corporate walkout, a garage, and the almost collapse of an animation studio. And this is how that happened. Long before he was known for anything scientific, John B. Calhoun was a bird watcher. He got his start in this field partly through Amelia Lasky, who was an ornithologist in the field that he really admired. She helped shape his early interest in like watching and observing animals and really taking that time and patience to see how they functioned in their own world, which is, as it turns out, the same skill that you need to watch mice for days and days and weeks and months on end. John would eventually move to the suburbs of Baltimore with his family and start working with Johns Hopkins University through the Rodent Ecology Project. It was through his work with this project that he made an observation that maybe seemed small and insignificant at the time, but grew into something much, much bigger. Part of his work on the project was basically trying to help develop more effective rat poison, and what he noticed was that rats on a given city block, on any city block, would never let their population expand past the 150 mark. And my man John just could not let that question go. Why would they self-regulate their population at 150? Off the back of this observation, in around 1947, John decides to continue down this path. He has to find an answer. He would set up colonies of Norway rats and see how they would develop their society. Again and again and again, the populations would always self-level. Sometimes they would reach up to 200, but they would almost always fall back to right around 150. And even more interesting, once they hit that 150 mark, they would split up into like 12 little colonies inside of this bigger living situation. It was almost like they were creating their own little separate neighborhoods. So my man John is continuing to develop this research. He's noting all of this. He's starting to make some publications. At this point, he moves again to, I think it was Silver Springs, Maryland or something like that, still around the Baltimore area, but he started working with the National Institute of Mental Health and Walter Reed. National Institute of Mental Health, the acronym also stands for NIMH. As he continued this research, he started to notice even more and more patterns. Not only would the rodent populations always cap themselves right around 150 and separate into these smaller neighborhoods, they actually started to develop something that looked a lot like our own society at the time. There was hierarchy, they had territories, they had stress and strain, and all of it was dependent on how much space each rodent had. It was that idea about the amount of space that they had specifically, not food, not water, not safety, how many predators was in the area, but it was specifically around space that John Calhoun really gripped onto. It became his obsession, and to test it fully, he created something called Universe 25. Inside of Universe 25, he grew a population of mice that had everything that they could possibly need except space. They had unlimited food, they had unlimited water, they had absolutely no predators, so there should have been no stress whatsoever. All they didn't have was more space. Initially, it looked like paradise to these mice. They started to grow their population infinitely, generation after generation, filling up every space that they had available. But as their population began to peak, their society started to break. They stopped forming healthy bonds with each other. Some of the mice just withdrew completely and entirely. Fun fact, the mice that broke off and would only groom themselves, they stopped eating and drinking to only groom themselves. Calhoun called them the beautiful ones, and they were basically like a subset of mice that just completely gave up on society. All they cared about was grooming themselves, and that was it. So eventually the population didn't just cap itself at 150 with all of these little sub neighborhoods as it did before. It actually completely collapsed. With Universe 25 and the experiment that Calhoun ran, he basically proved that abundance does not mean survival. Now, normally scientific research doesn't always get the most publication with the masses, as it were, but this came at a time in the world where people started to become very aware and concerned with the concept of overpopulation. There were genuine questions being asked at this point around what happens when there's nowhere else for us to expand to? Like, what happens when the entire Earth is covered with people and we have no more space? And so you can see how Calhoun's experiments at this time were definitely something of a topic for discussion, not only among scientists, but among people in general. His studies and Universe 25 made John Calhoun kind of famous for a little while, but unfortunately, like all things do, the world just kind of moved on, his funding dried up, and his experiments stopped. And so the man who had spent his life studying the withdrawal and collapse of society was eventually sidelined by his own scientific community and left in the past. But Calhoun's research did have an impact that he maybe most probably did not expect at all. While his focus was on the scientific community and the real-world applications of what he was studying, it slowly inspired a children's book. If you haven't put it together yet, the children's book that it inspired was called Mrs. Frisbee and the Rats of NIMH, or otherwise known as The Rats of NIMH, which, if you remember, stands for the National Institute of Mental Health. It was a children's book that was explicitly and directly inspired by the work that Calhoun had done. The book focused on rats and themes like intelligence, society, and the thin line between order and chaos. In some ways, Calhoun's research and data completely outlived his career. It was just in an entirely different field than he could have ever predicted. So how does this all translate back into Hollywood? Well, at the same time that Calhoun is running all of these experiments and gaining traction in the scientific community, Disney is sitting on their own rodent masterpiece. It was back in 1959 that author Marjorie Sharp published a book called The Rescuers. Way back in 1962, Disney optioned this book, but eventually it got shelved for like a decade. At the time, they were worried about like political undertones or something like that, but all we need to know right now is that it got shelved pretty much indefinitely at the time. And so for almost 10 years, it sat there on Disney's shelf until around 1970, when somebody named Don Bluth picked it up. The funny thing is that Don Bluth actually picked this up as a way to train new animators that Disney had brought in. There was this whole mindset of Disney needed to bring in some fresh blood and kind of keep the animators circling so nobody got like complacent with their animations, I guess. And so there was a group of young animators that were brought in and worked with Don Bluth directly, and this was like basically their project that they were given to help bring their animation skills up to speed. They were given The Rescuers and told to make it happen. And many of the animators that worked on The Rescuers as part of this young animation group would go on to be the animators that brought us the Disney Renaissance. But at the time, nobody that was working on this like tiny shelved project had any idea the impact that they would bring to the industry. Don Bluth's own path through Disney is kind of a separate story. He worked there at multiple points. Like initially he worked on Sleeping Beauty back in like 1955. He ended up leaving and coming back in like the early 70s to work on films like Robin Hood. So by the time he was working on The Rescuers with all of these new animators, he was at a role called directing animator. The Rescuers came out, it was a hit, everybody loved it, but by 1979, Don Bluth is looking at Disney thinking, this is not the place that it used to be. To this day, Don Bluth has been a huge advocate for hand-drawn animation, and he saw Disney was kind of moving towards this more commodified version, you know, the how fast can we produce things, and starting to stray away from the hand-drawn animation that made Disney so special. He was just like, I don't like this, I really don't think that this is the right way to go, and he started to lose faith in the company. And on September 13th, 1979, he resigned from Disney. Again. The very next day, 11 other animators at Disney, including Gary Oldman and John Pomeroy, walked out with him. It actually became known as the Disney Exodus. It was about like 12 people that completely left the studio, left everything behind, saying that they would rather find their own way than be stuck, like essentially being told what to do. They just wanted the room to create what they wanted. Ironically, it kind of mirrors the work that Calhoun was doing with the mice. These animators at Disney had everything that they needed in terms of like stability and abundance. They were working for a multi-million, billion-dollar company at the time, but they just didn't have the space, metaphorically, technically, to create what they wanted. They didn't have the creative space to make what they wanted, and it began to feel like a cage. And so we find our way to the garage that I mentioned at the beginning. Don Bluth and his band of animators that walked out with him, not all of them, but most of them, ended up in his garage starting something called Don Bluth Productions. And they bet everything on themselves. They started working on something called Banjo the Woodpile Cat, I think it was called. They were betting on the fact that there were still people people that loved the type of animation that they were doing, the hand-drawn, authentic type of animation. By this time, Don Bluth had already known about and was a fan of the book Mrs. Frisby and the Rats of NIMH, and he decided he wanted to make that into a movie. Interestingly enough, he had already pitched this to Disney and been rejected because they thought that the themes were like too dark and they didn't really want to make a dark movie at that time, ironically, because then they went on to make The Black Cauldron, but we'll get into that. The Secrets of NIMH was a movie he ended up creating with Don Bluth Productions, which was based on Mrs. Frisby and the Rats of NIMH. To produce this, the team that he had worked from like 6 a.m. till midnight every single day to get this done, and it paid off because The Secrets of NIMH was actually a very well-received movie. Once again, life mimics art in some way because you had a band of animators who left everything behind, fighting like the underdogs, and they went on to create a film that was about small creatures fighting in a world that didn't give them the room to survive. Back at Disney in like the fall of 1984, Michael Eisner took over. He brought in Jeffrey Katzenberg to run the studio, and then came the Black Cauldron incident. If you don't know about the Black Cauldron incident at Disney, let me just tell you this. That film had a $44 million budget at Disney, and it only grossed around $21 million worldwide. It was the most expensive animated film Disney had made up until that point, and so the fact that it was such a massive economic flop was really not good for Disney. The fallout was so severe that Disney moved its animators completely out of like the main studio area and basically pushed them into like a warehouse down the street because they wanted to leave the main studio area a place for like the live action productions that were actually making them money. And into that environment where the animators had been physically removed from the main studio and like pushed off to the side in a warehouse down the street came the Basil of Baker Street. Basil of Baker Street was another project that had been shelved for quite some time. It was actually pitched directly following the success of The Rescuers, but it never ended up going anywhere. Disney told the animators they could make this movie, but they slashed the budget for this thing in half like immediately. I think they went from like a $25 million budget down to like a $12 million budget. Unrelated to what Disney was working on, but at the same time, there was actually a movie called Young Sherlock that also flopped at the box office. I don't think that was a Disney movie, but just the concept of it flopped. Because of the flop of Young Sherlock, this is also when there's like a discussion around the naming convention, and they change it from Basil of Baker Street, which is the book that it's based off of, that was a lot of B's, to The Great Mouse Detective. Sitting in the animator's seat, knowing that your budget has been slashed by half, the current management of the company does not value animation at all, and being physically moved out of the main studio lot, there's a lot riding on a movie about a very small mouse. And thankfully, The Great Mouse Detective did exactly what it needed to do. Even with the film's tiny budget, it ended up going on to gross over, I think, $40 million at the box office. After the flop and failure of The Black Cauldron, this was a massive success, and it also would kind of be the foot back in the door that the animators needed, which brought us into the Disney Renaissance. While all of this was going on at Disney, over at Don Bluth Studios, they were still riding the high of the success of The Secrets of NIMH, and a new collaborator showed up. Steven Spielberg. Spielberg had approached Don Bluth and said, I want to work with you. Like, let's find something to work on. Spielberg specifically told Don Bluth that he wanted him to make him something pretty like The Secrets of NIMH. The result of this conversation with Spielberg, as well as an idea that Don Bluth kind of already had brewing around, was a movie called An American Tail. A little interesting fact is that originally An American Tail was going to be a fully animal-based world with no humans in it, but Steven Spielberg actually watched The Rescuers, and after seeing how well they were able to cross over the human and animal world, they decided to make An American Tail in the same fashion. So it's kind of funny that like this little piece of Disney DNA wound its way into An American Tail after all. Don Bluth Studios created An American Tail on a budget of only $9 million, but the film would go on to gross over $85 million worldwide, and it came out in theaters 3 months after The Great Mouse Detective. And this is how we land in 1986 with multiple mice-related movies showing up at the box office at the same time. These two mouse-related movies, as well as their predecessor, The Secret of NIMH and The Rescuers, all share the same underlying DNA. The same names are involved, the same companies are involved, and they all trace back to the same moment in history. If we step back, the entire shape of this story in some ways matches up to the original research that John Calhoun had back in his labs. A population that's given everything that they need except for space to be individuals will eventually collapse. That's what happened with Universe 25. And it's also, in its own very human way, the same exact thing that happened with the animators and the Disney Exodus back in '79, where you had an animation department with all of the talent and all of the resources, financial backing that they needed, but they did not have the space to be individuals, and it caused collapse. From a scientific perspective, Calhoun's research ended up being kind of a dead end. Not only did he lose his funding, but his research is actually these days mostly a footnote in psychology textbooks, and he's more remembered by like field specialists than the public in general. But the questions that he raised with his initial research didn't disappear at all. They went from a box of mice in a lab to a successful children's book to a shelved movie idea, into a garage, into a nearly closed down animation department, and finally into millions of movie screens all over the countries where you had kids of all ages watching these tiny little creatures fight for their right to survive. And I think if John Calhoun was sitting in a movie theater watching some of these movies, I hope that he was able to see his influence even if he didn't directly acknowledge it. Because I really think somewhere between the science and the cartoons, everybody that was involved, including the mice, the animators, and obviously Calhoun himself, ended up kind of proving his point in like a weird roundabout way, whether they meant to or not. Anyway, that's the rabbit hole that I went down this week. I found it absolutely fascinating that you could tie these scientific experiments from like the 40s, 50s, 60s to the movies that I remember watching as a kid. Like I remember loving The Great Mouse Detective, The Rescuers Down Under, which came after the success of The Great Mouse Detective and An American Tail. Like I remember all these things, and I find it just fascinating to know the triggers behind some of it that I never would have expected. So let me know what you thought. If you loved any of these movies, let me know down below. And if there's any movies that you want to have me look into and see if there's some sort of fun invisible string behind them, let me know, because I love to dig into this kind of stuff. I hope that you enjoyed this video, and I will see you guys in my next one. I'm still working on my Polly Pocket videos, I promise. I just haven't really finished that one up yet. So I will see you guys in the next one. Bye!